Thank you all for coming tonight. We really have a full house, and I know that you expect and we expect to have a wonderful semester here of classes. Let me introduce myself to those of you who don't know me. I'm Dr. Mark Brannon. I'm the president of the Princeton Adult School, and along with many of the other members of the board of the Princeton Adult School, we all welcome you. We've met some of the members before, and many of them are out there handing out tickets tonight. Please keep those tickets, and then you won't have to be asked who you are to be checked off, so it just shows the tickets in the future. I do this almost every semester. I've been standing up here because I'm interested in how many of you have taken courses with us before. So if I just ask with a show of hands, can you tell me if you've been to one of our lecture series before? That is just so amazing. That's really incredible. The returning group, and for those of you who are new, thank you for coming, but we hope to live up to everybody's expectations. We have a few more seats down the front, and if you have seats next to you that you just have your jackets on, please remove the jackets so that people know they're available. And everybody should have a seat. Many of you received this handout as you came in, and there are more down here on the front two tables if you did not get them, so afterwards you can get them. This is a handout about a whole year's worth of courses that are pertinent to the subject matter on the Fertile Crescent, Gender and Society. This is co-sponsored by Princeton University and many other sponsors as well. There's some more of the handouts, and we would invite any of you to take these and peruse over them and please participate. I also want to thank Princeton University because they are the co-sponsors with us, the Princeton Adult School and Princeton University, especially the Community Auditing Program of the Princeton University's Office of Community and Regional Affairs. They're the people who arranged for us to use this wonderful classroom and have all the audiovisual equipment working, we hope. And so once again, thanks to Princeton University. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, there are two small pieces of information that I need to share with you, and that is that we've had, because of unforeseen changes, people were out of the country on their expected days of lecturing. I have written on the middle board there the 2 dates that we've had changed since we put it all into this brochure that you received in the mail. Next week's lecture will be given by Professor Catherine Fleming, who is a member of the history faculty at New York University. Many of you may know her and know her illustrious father, John Fleming, who has been a long-time professor here at Princeton. Professor Fleming has actually been willing to substitute for her husband, who has had to be called out of the country next Tuesday night. And so she is going to be giving a lecture. Her specialty is also Islam. And she's going to be talking about Islam in Europe, a historical perspective. And the talk will focus primarily on Muslims in the Balkans from 1800 on. So the Balkan area of the Muslim world will be the focus of next week's lecture. And then on November the 13th, Professor Abed Awad of the Rutgers School of Law at Newark, and a lawyer, will be talking on the same subject as was previously announced. Why does Islamic jurisprudence matter today? The original speaker was unable to keep that commitment, so we were able to get an excellent replacement. Okay, now on to the topic of tonight. Professor Michael Cook is going to be our lecturer tonight, and many of you know him. He's been in Princeton for a number of years. He is the class of 1943 University Professor of Near Eastern Studies in the Near Eastern Department. In planning on how to introduce a man of such stature, I have gotten a lot of different comments, but one that I have taken the liberty of quoting something that's on his webpage in the Near Eastern Studies Department. I didn't even tell him I was going to quote this, but he wrote this himself. So, quote, "I was educated at Cambridge, the real Cambridge, not the one in Massachusetts. I spent 2 years there studying English and European history and 2 more learning Turkish and Persian. From there, I went on to the School of Oriental and African Studies in the University of London, where I embarked on research into Ottoman population history in the 15th and 16th centuries. I then spent a good many years teaching and researching in Islamic history at the School of Oriental and African Studies till in 1986 I crossed the Atlantic to take up a position at Princeton. End quotes. Professor Cook teaches an undergraduate level course in the first semester usually, and it's on the introductory course in fall, and then usually teaches a course in Islamic history from 600 to 1800 in the spring. And I was fortunate enough to be an author in this course a couple of years ago. I know you're going to be in for a great discussion. There are so many awards that we could mention, but we don't have the time, so I'm only going to mention two. And one goes back a few years when Professor Cook was selected by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation as one of 5 winners of this Distinguished Achievement Award, an award which is intended to honor scholars who have made significant contributions to the humanities and to provide the recipients and their institutions with resources to deepen and extend humanistic research. And the other thing I want to show is right off of Amazon. I got a copy of a book that's called The New Cambridge History of Islam. The general editor of this 6-volume book is Professor Cook. And if you hurry back home, you can order the last 6-volume set for only $1,150. But more importantly, this is so well regarded, it has received the 2011 Waldo Leyland Prize for the most outstanding reference tool in the field of history, published between May of 2006 and April of 2011. So I need to say nothing more in introduction. The topic is why the rise of Islam is a very surprising historical event. And let us welcome Professor Michael Cook.
Okay, are you hearing me loud and clear?
Yes.
The electronics
Yes.
working?
Could be louder, please.
Okay, what do I do to make it louder? This is electronic device, right? Amy, you know this. Okay, is this okay now? I don't want to deafen people. Okay, good. Okay, thank you, Mark, for that kind introduction. And yes, it was really great when something we did in Middle Eastern history, in Islamic history, got recognized by the American Historical Association, who basically most of the time ignore us. Okay, you've all seen my title, but I also have a subtitle. Right, you don't have to be an ornithologist to recognize a black swan, right? And I assume that enough of you suffered through the financial crisis and the aftermath that you picked up the term black swan event. But in case you didn't, let me just give you a rough and ready definition. A black swan event is an event that is very unlikely in prospect, and in retrospect, it had a tremendous impact. And I think that's a pretty good way to describe the rise of Islam. But of course, what you couldn't help noticing is the fact that I have not one black swan, but 2 black swans there, right? You weren't seeing double. There really are 2 black swans there. And there's a kind of division of labor between them. The one on the left is the political black swan, and the one on the right is the religious black swan. So let me try and make a bit of sense of that. And we'll start with the one on the left, the political one. And here what I'm showing you is a couple of coins. And you look at those coins and you've already noticed that they are virtually identical. Let me see if I can find the pointer. Yeah, it's over here. I mean, it's not just the general design is similar, but if you look at the writing in the middle there and the writing in the middle there, you may not have a clue what it means, but it's clearly saying pretty much the same thing. So I think you could draw some inferences from that. One would be that two coins so similar must have been minted by the same state. Another would be that they must have been minted very close together in time, or they wouldn't look so similar. And another would be that they must have been minted very close together in space, or they wouldn't look so similar. Okay, that's what you might expect. Now let's check that out. First of all, yes, you're right. They were minted by the same state. The Islamic State, the Caliphate, the empire that the Arabs had created in the 7th and early 8th centuries. Secondly, they were indeed minted pretty close together in time. They're just 8 years apart. But were they minted close together in space? No, absolutely not. Something like 5,000 miles apart. So what that tells you, what that dramatizes for you, is the fact that at that point we have a state that can impose the same coin design on two places 5,000 miles apart and everywhere in between. And let me just show you it on a map. So, way over here we have Spain. Over here we have what's now Afghanistan. And somewhere in between and a bit off to the south, we have the Arabian Peninsula, the wilderness of Arabia, where it all started. And just to give you a basic sense of the chronology of these conquests, these Arab conquests, so 630s and 640s, they've taken up the Persian Empire, one empire, and they've cut two important provinces of another empire, the Byzantine Empire. And then it sort of continues, and I've left that aside, and we get to the 710s. And then that's the point at which the Arabs conquer Spain, most of it. Transoxania, that's roughly Uzbekistan today, and Sindh in northwestern India. Okay, now that already is looking like a bit of a black swan, isn't it? I mean, if you think of it, never before in history were Spain and Afghanistan ruled by the same state. And it's never happened again as of the fall of 2012, right? Nevertheless, let's push back on that a little. You could, after all, say that, well, there have been other episodes in history where tribal peoples, wild tribal peoples, have gone a-conquering and created empires for themselves. I mean, think, for example, of the biggest example of all time, the Mongols in the 13th century. That's a lot more than 5,000 miles. I haven't tried to figure out exactly how many it is. But there you have an empire that stretches from Eastern Europe all the way through to Manchuria. And the Mongols weren't the only people coming from that area, the steppes, the grasslands that go across from Europe into Asia. They weren't the only people who, setting out from the steppes, have created empires. There were people before them that did it. There were people after them that did it. But there's a reason for that. Just take a very quick look at Mongolia. And what you see is a lot of grass. Now that grass is a resource. That is a relatively rich material base for a society. It's not rich by the standards of, rich agricultural societies, but as nomadic societies go, that's fairly affluent, what you're seeing there. It's going to support a lot of livestock, that's going to support a lot of Mongols or whatever nomads it is, and it's going to make it possible for rulers, states, to emerge among these nomadic populations. And once you have rulers, rulers can organize people, and they can organize them to go a-conquering the world. And that's exactly what happens with the Mongols in the 13th century. and in other cases before and after. So take a last look at that grass, and then let's shift to Arabia. That's a very different environment. That is not much of a resource base. And this means that Arabian society is going to be much poorer than Mongolian or steppe society. So we have a poor resource base. The societies that live off that resource base are largely stateless, no rulers. And in the absence of rulers, it's very hard to organize the Arabs for one big movement of conquest. Yeah, the Arabs spend their time fighting each other on a small scale. Getting them together is virtually impossible. And that fits with the fact that it only ever happens once. Only in the 7th century do the Arabs come out of Arabia and conquer an enormous empire. They've never done it before, and they're never doing it again. Okay, so that is one of the black swans. The fact that we have this enormous empire conquered by people coming from such an unpromising homeland. So, one black swan. What about the other one? Well, for that, the religious one, let's go back to the coins. And this time, we've got to get through the problem of reading the writing. What I'm interested in is the bit in the middle, there and there, identical. And here is what it says. There is no God, but God alone, without companion. In other words, the Arabs are advertising their monotheism. Now that in itself, the fact that the Arabs are monotheists in this period is no big deal. As swans go, it's a pretty white swan. Why? Because it fits into a much larger context. You probably know this context, but just to remind you, monotheism starts off as an idea, rather idiosyncratic idea, of the ancient Israelites. Nobody else is much interested, and it stays that way for centuries. Then, in the 1st century of our era, out of Judaism emerges Christianity. And it's the Christians who then start spreading monotheism on a serious scale to other peoples. But even then, they don't have a whole lot of success for something like 300 years. I mean, all they managed to do is to create Christian minorities here, there, and everywhere in the Roman Empire. And then, suddenly, something unexpected happens in the early 4th century. This is one of those periods when the Roman Empire is in a state of civil war. The question is, who is going to be the next emperor? And there's stiff competition. And one of the competitors is Constantine. And what Constantine does is to place a bet on Christianity. He places a bet on the Christian God. And the Christian God comes through for him. He wins the battle, the key battle, in 312, and goes on. There's a whole lot more civil war after that, but he goes on to become sole emperor of the Roman Empire. And from this point on, there is tremendous imperial patronage backing up Christianity. So naturally you get a kind of bandwagon effect. You get it inside the Roman Empire. From the time of Constantine onwards, you don't have to be a pietist. You don't have to be somebody in search of martyrdom to convert to Christianity. People like you and me begin to see that it might be a good idea to get on this bandwagon to convert to Christianity. But this demonstration effect is also happening outside the Roman Empire. And what you get after Constantine is people after people around the Roman Empire getting on the Christian bandwagon. I've given you some of them there, haven't I? Yeah, I mean the Armenians, the Georgians, the Ethiopians, the French, the Irish, the English. you name it. Every people within shouting distance of the Roman Empire, sooner or later, is converting to Christianity. And Christianity is, until that period, by far the most successful form of monotheism when it comes to spreading its message. So that is a tremendous trend. And insofar as the Arabs have become monotheists, they've just done what everybody else has done. They've moved from their ancestral paganism to monotheism. But wait a minute. Here we have one of the biggest, most important trends in the history of the western half of the old world. But wherever there's a trend, there is always somebody bucking it. So let's take a look at who's bucking this trend. Well, first, most obviously, you have really obstinate pagans who are just not getting the message. And I guess the most striking example of that is the Lithuanians. The Lithuanians stayed pagan right down to the 14th century. Everybody around them had converted to Christianity. Everybody was saying to the Lithuanians, look, we're going to continue beating you up until you convert. And it took until the 14th century to make that decision. That's one way you can buck the trend. Another way you can buck the trend is to say, okay, monotheism, great. But why do we have to take it in the form of Christianity? There's also Jewish monotheism, isn't there? We could adopt Judaism. And there's a couple of peoples that do that. One of them, the most famous of them being the Khazars, who are a Turkic people north of the Caucasus. But there's a third possibility. The possibility that you could kind of customize monotheism for your own people. You could come up with a monotheism of your own. And that is what the Arabs do. And they are the only people that do that. So that is the second black swan. So we got those two black swans there. Yeah, at this point I want to say a little bit more about how Islam, we can use the name now, Arab monotheism, is a monotheism customized for the Arabs. I'll come back to it again later, it's an important theme. But for now, what I want to do is flip those coins over. I'm afraid I don't have a picture of the other side, so you'll just have to take my word for it that what it says on the other side is this. Okay, so in the center there, God, one, God the everlasting refuge. So far that's just good, straight monotheism. And then, who has not begotten and has not been begotten. Now that is transparently a swipe at the Christians. The Christians believe in God the Father, God the Son, and the Holy Ghost. The Holy Ghost we can leave aside. But this Father and Son belief of Christianity is being trashed here. God does not have is not a father, and he does not have a son. And equal to him is not anyone. And then in the margin, on the other side, Muhammad is the messenger of God, who has sent him with the guidance and the religion of truth, that he may uplift it above every religion, though the polytheists be averse. Okay, so Muhammad is the one that has the real message. Everything else is not the real message from God. And polytheists, that could refer to the pagans in Arabia, but it could just as well refer to the Christians, because the Christians don't believe in one God from this point of view. They believe in three, right? They're polytheists. So here you have a very strong statement on the back of this coin that Arab monotheism, Islam, is something distinct from other alleged forms of monotheism, and it's the real thing. Okay, so now I've at least identified both my black swans for you. What I want to do from now on is to try and make some sense of those two extraordinary facts about the Arabs. That very unlikely series of conquests that they engage in, and that unique way in which they customize monotheism for themselves. And here, obviously, we have to go back to Muhammad, whose name we just had on the coin. Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam. And there, in a nutshell, is his career. Born in Mecca. Where's Mecca? So here we have Arabia, and Mecca is right there. He's born in Mecca around 570. 40 years later, he begins to have revelations. Then, maybe 12 years later, he moves from Mecca to Medina. We can leave Medina aside for now, and he dies there in Medina in 622. But for now, let's concentrate on Mecca. So there, very briefly, is the setup in Mecca. It's a settlement in Western Arabia inhabited by a single tribe, the tribe of Quraysh. Now, you might expect that to give them a lot of solidarity, and it certainly gives them some. But like any typical Arabian tribe, the tribe of Quraysh is divided into clans, and the clans are not always on good terms with one another. So this is, in a literal sense, an anarchic society. And this is the point I really want to emphasize above all. There is no ruler in sight. There's no ruler in Mecca. There's no ruler anywhere else that includes Mecca in his domains. Anarchic, rulerless society. Okay, now here, in order to get across the importance of this fact, the absence of any ruler, I want just to quickly outline the process by which my own ancestors converted to monotheism in the form of Christianity. And there were three really key actors in this. One of them was the Pope, Gregory the Great. He's the one who conceived the idea of trying to convert the English to Christianity. He's the one who said, let's try this. And what he did was to send a missionary, Augustine, not Peter Brown's Augustine, not the Augustine of the Confessions. This is our English Augustine of Canterbury, except he didn't come from Canterbury. Canterbury is where he went to. He presumably came from Italy. That's the second major actor. And the third major actor, and the actor who has no equivalent in Mecca, and this is the important bit, is King Ethelbert of Kent. The English King of Kent, who has been on the throne for something, getting on for 40 years. He's a very seasoned, very experienced, very savvy ruler. So what happens? Well, Augustine arrives off the coast of Kent, on a little island off the coast of Kent in 597, when Muhammad is a young man who hasn't yet started having his revelations. The first thing that happens after Augustine arrives is that he gets a message from the king. The king says, stay right there, don't move, and I'll come and talk to you. And a couple of days later, Ethelbert shows up on the island and says to Augustine, okay, make your pitch. And Augustine then lays out the Christian message. And Ethelbert, a savvy ruler, he figures out, I mean, I'm putting thoughts into his mind, but it's pretty obvious, he figures out, one, that adopting Christianity could be a great opportunity, it could do him good, but two, there could be a terrible backlash from the English pagans. So what does he do? Like any savvy politician, he plays for time and looks for a middle way. What he says to Augustine is, well, basically his answer is no but. And I'll come to the no in a minute. The but is, you can come to Canterbury, Ethelbert's capital. You can come to Canterbury, you can set up there, I will protect you, I'll make sure no harm comes to you, and you can preach, and we'll see what happens. In other words, if things go really sour, Ethelbert can put them on a boat and send them back to the continent. If things go well, then maybe Ethelbert himself will convert, as he did eventually. What is crucial about Mecca and about Arabia in general is the absence of any kind of Ethelbert figure. And this has two implications. One, which I'm not completely sure about, but I think I'm sort of right on this. When you don't have a king who can tip the balance in your favor when you're trying to spread a new religious message, when you don't have a Constantine or an Elector of Saxony or an Ethelbert, your sales pitch is going to have to be that much more attractive, because you're going to have to get your message across solely at grassroots level. Nobody up there, no ruling power, is going to help you out. So you have to make your message more attractive, and one way of doing that is to customize it, and I'm going to say more about that in a minute. The other problem you have is security. And if there had been a backlash against Augustine, Ethelbert would have protected him and maybe sent him out of the country by the next boat. By contrast, in Mecca, Muhammad has nobody to solve that problem for him, and I'll come back to that. So let's start with customizing the message. And here, just to set a contrast, I want to come back to Ethelbert and the moment when he said no before he said but. And that's what he said. This is how he put it. He says, the words and promises you bring are fair indeed. Yes, Christianity sounds really good. But since they are new and uncertain, I cannot assent to them, abandoning what I, with the whole English people, have observed for so long. In other words, Ethelbert, the savvy politician, has put his finger on a key problem with converting to Christianity. It's an identity problem. It's the fact that Christianity is a foreign religion. We English don't like foreign things that much. I mean, let me spell it out. What's foreign about Christianity? Well, first, Jesus was a Jew. Augustine was an Italian, at least I assume he was. The Bible is in Latin, which we don't understand a word of. And what's even worse, what's so disrespectful, is that nowhere in the Bible does God even mention the English. Okay, just sort of keep that in mind as a contrast. And now we go to Arabia. And here I'm giving you something that Muhammad said. Do I know that he said it? No, I don't. I wasn't there. In fact, I suspect he didn't say it. But it encapsulates a message that I'll sort of demonstrate in a minute from quotations from the Quran. But here we get the message in a very simple form. Muhammad is saying, love the Arabs for 3 reasons. Because I am an Arab, because the Quran is in Arabic, and because the language of the inhabitants of paradise is Arabic. So if you plan to go to paradise, take Arabic 101. Okay, that's what Muhammad is said to have said. But now let's go to his revelation, the Quran. And I can show you at least 2 of those elements in what he said there already in the Quran. First of all, implicitly, Muhammad is an Arab. We have this passage, it's not the only one, where this is God speaking about himself. Truly God was gracious to the believers when he raised up among them a messenger from themselves. He didn't send an Italian Right? He said an Arab, one of themselves, and that's very respectful. Something else that God says several times in the Quran, he makes the point that this revelation is in Arabic. We have sent it down as an Arabic Quran. Now, addressing people in their own language, again, shows respect. He didn't address us in English. He addressed us in Latin, right? And we had to put up with that and learn the wretched language. Now, there's nothing in the Quran about the linguistic situation in paradise, I'm afraid. But let me take you to something else. Now, you know, Mecca, in the center of Mecca, there is a cubical building known as the Kaaba. Now, when Muhammad was a young man, in fact, until his last years, the Kaaba was, for all intents and purposes, a pagan sanctuary. Pagan gods were worshipped all around it. There was a pagan idol inside the Kaaba. It was a pagan sanctuary. But what the Quran, what God is saying here, is that really, the Kaaba is not a pagan sanctuary at all. Really, originally, it's a monotheist sanctuary. And who built it? Abraham and Ishmael. Well, he doesn't say the Kaaba, he just says the house. And you might wonder what house might he be talking about. But I mean, put it this way, to everybody who reads the Quran within a religious framework, it's immediately obvious that the house means the Kaaba in Mecca. Now, that dot, dot, dot at the end there is because I want to just break for a minute and probably just remind you of something out of the book of Genesis. We had Abraham and Ishmael there in the Quran. Well, Abraham in the book of Genesis has two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. And as often happens when you have two sons, there is sibling rivalry. And the question is, who gets what? And according to the book of Genesis, well, there's something for each of them. Ishmael and his descendants get to be a great nation. But it's, so to speak, a purely secular reward they get. By contrast, Isaac and his descendants get the covenant. Sacred history goes from Abraham through Isaac, not through Ishmael. Now, in the 7th century, the terms Israelites and Ishmaelites for descendants of Isaac and Ishmael are not really in sort of common vernacular usage. But everybody who's at all educated knows that when God in Genesis talks about the Israelites, that's the same as the Jews today. And when he talks about the Ishmaelites, that's the same as the Arabs today. So God here, for any 7th century reader of Genesis, is talking about the Jews and the Arabs and the relationship between them. So what Muhammad has done is to open up a line of sacred history that instead of going through Isaac, he's not going to deny that, but he's going to open up a new line that goes through Ishmael. And here you see an example, Abraham and Ishmael together. Isaac is nowhere to be seen. They're building God's house in Mecca, building a monotheist sanctuary in Arabia. So there again, you get this playing to Arab identity. Now let me go on to the rest of the quotation. So it continues, our Lord, this is Abraham and Ishmael praying, make of our seed a nation submissive to thee. Now the word nation here is ummah, and some of you may have heard that term as a term that's used to refer to the entire worldwide Muslim community at the present day. Here you have it already. A nation submissive, submissive is muslima. The A at the end is just the feminine. Muslim, Muslim. That's the word we're seeing here. You could translate this, a Muslim nation. So make of our seed, the descendants of Ishmael are going to be a Muslim nation. And our Lord, do thou send among them a messenger, one of them. Again, that theme, by implication, an Arab, not some foreigner. And of course, the reference implicitly is to Muhammad. And what this is telling you, what God is saying, is that already back in the time of Abraham and Ishmael, they prayed to God that in the fullness of time he should send Muhammad to the Arabs. And I mean, what the passage explains, and I've left it out to make so things aren't too complicated, it explains that in due course things are going to go off track. The Arabs, in effect, are going to lapse into paganism, and it'll be time to wake them up, to send them a messenger, to wake them up and get them back to their original monotheism. And that's what Muhammad does. So in other words, what this is saying, to paraphrase it very briefly, is when Muhammad talks to the Arabs and says, you guys should convert to monotheism, and they say, no, we don't like that foreign stuff. He's saying, monotheism is not foreign one bit for us Arabs. We were originally monotheists back in the time of Ishmael. We kept it up for a few generations, then we kind of lapsed into paganism. But monotheism is our Arab birthright. Okay, so in all this, what you can see is Muhammad customizing his message to appeal to Arab identity, doing something that Augustine could never have done for the English. Okay, so that's maybe one of my black swans, kind of made sense of, certainly not explained. I don't have that ambition, but I hope I've made some sense of it. Let me now come to the other one. And what I'm talking about here is state formation and conquest, what I actually began with. So, here again you see the career of the Prophet, but this time what interests us is the move from Mecca to Medina in 622. I think yes, let's have the map again. So he's going from Mecca just there to Medina just there, about 200 miles to the north. Now, what would he want to do that for? Well, it comes back to this problem of there being no ruler. Now, remember, Muhammad is a monotheist prophet, and it's part of the job description of a monotheist prophet that you tell people that the pagan gods they worship are false gods, and they should only worship the one true God who has sent you. In other words, monotheist zeal and good manners don't go together. It is part of Muhammad's job description to trash the pagan gods. Now, what kind of a reaction does that get? Well, the basic default of the pagans in Mecca, and this probably applies in Arabia generally, they're very tolerant, as you see in that first reaction when somebody says, why shouldn't a man choose a religion for himself? And so what? Whose business is it? If these guys want to adopt this Islam thing, why not? But of course, the trouble is the bad manners. And that's what gets the pagans irritated. And they come to Muhammad's uncle, who as long as he lives is protecting Muhammad, and they say to him, your nephew has cursed our gods, insulted our religion, mocked our way of life, and accused our forefathers of error. Now, we just can't take this anymore. You've got to do something about it. Shut him up. And it's not just Muhammad himself who's under threat, it's also his followers in Mecca. Muhammad and his Muslim followers have a real security problem. So what is Muhammad to do about it? There's no electoral Saxony to take him under his wing. There's no ruler to protect him. He has to find something for himself. Now here, let's go back to the English case again. And here we've forgotten about the Pope. We're just concentrating on what's happening in Kent. On the one hand, we have Augustine, the missionary, and on the other hand, we have King Ethelbert. and King Ethelbert is the one who is going to protect Augustine. But nothing like that in Mecca. So what does Muhammad do? Well, he goes around trying to find a tribe that is willing to protect him. So you get this account. The Prophet used to present himself to the Arab tribes at fairs, calling them to God and telling them that he was a prophet with a mission and asking them to believe in him and protect him. And the standard reaction of the Arab tribes that he goes to with this request is, nah, this guy is trouble. We don't want anything to do with him. So it looks like things are going to come to a bad end until one day he meets some tribesmen from Medina. And this time, for the first time, somebody listens to Muhammad. So they accepted his message, and they told him, when we set out from Medina, our people were riven by internecine feuds more than any other. Maybe God will unite them through you. Now notice one very typical thing about the Arabs of that period. Yeah, they accept Muhammad's message, they believe. But they don't go on about that. They don't say, you know, you have answered our spiritual yearnings or anything like that. They go on to the political bottom line of this. And the political bottom line is that Medina is in a mess. Everybody's at everybody else's throats. And maybe this Muhammad, this monotheist prophet, could be a solution to that political problem. And just to give you the setup in Medina, remember Mecca was one Arab tribe. Here we've got 5 tribes. Mecca, the one tribe was straightforwardly Arab. Here we have 2 Arab tribes and 3 Jewish tribes. I mean, you can't expect this place to hold together even as well as Mecca did. Because again, there is no ruler in sight. So these Medinese see a political opportunity. Maybe if we get this monotheist prophet in, now this is something new to try. Maybe he can do some kind of an end run around our tribal structures and feuds. Maybe he can get our oasis together. And I want to give you just a couple of, not so much snaps, just a couple of quotations to give you a sense of what is involved here. And these, no, actually there are 3 quotations, and they come from a document that Western scholars have taken to calling the Constitution of Medina. It's sort of a bit like a constitution, but I don't think it's, I mean, if I was inventing the terminology, I wouldn't use the term constitution, but it's accepted as conventional. And it seems to be a document, seems to be authentic, and it seems to date from very early in Muhammad's time in Medina, after his move there in 622. Now, you don't need to bother about deciphering the details of this one, but just get a sense of how much of the existing tribal structure and practice is being carried over into the new order that Muhammad is establishing. The Banu Auf, sons of Auf, I mean, that is an Arab tribal group that had existed in Medina for a long, long time. It's still there. Tribal identity is not being wiped out. It continues. The Banu Auf keep to their tribal organization. The old tribal ways continue, and leadership, continuing to cooperate with each other in accordance with their former mutual aid agreements regarding blood money. Very typical tribal stuff, this, and it continues right on. And every subgroup of the Banu Auf, because Banu Auf is a clan, but there are sub-clans, every subgroup ransoms its captives according to what is customary. Again, custom is being continued and equitable among the believers. So, tremendous continuity with the old pagan tribal order. But on the other hand, things are changing. Let's see what's new. Two short quotations. First, this one that says, "The believers are each other's allies to the exclusion of other people." In other words, we now have this community of believers, and you're not allowed to make alliances with outsiders. So there is some kind of new religious community coming into existence, despite all this tribal carryover. And secondly, whatever you differ about should be brought before God and the messenger. Well, in practice, since God is not here on earth, that means you bring it before the messenger, Muhammad. So if you have a dispute and somebody has killed somebody else, and there's about to be a tremendous blood feud, you bring it to Muhammad. So what we see here is something that had not existed previously in Medina. Muhammad is now a judicial authority. He's not proactive in this, people have to come to him. But if they come to him, he's the one that decides the case. There's no executive authority here, just judicial authority. But in the course of his 10 years in Medina, that will change. And by the end of it, Muhammad is pretty straightforwardly the ruler of Medina and of his Muslim community in Medina. So in other words, Muhammad starts with this problem of security. He doesn't start by saying, "I'm here sent by God to establish a state." No, he starts with a problem of security. He solves that problem of security by appealing to some Medinese who would like to see a bit less mayhem in an oasis. They bring him to Medina, and he builds up his position there until he has established a state. That state is a byproduct of the security problem, but by the end of his life, it's as real a state as you can expect to find in the middle of Arabia. And so what I've shown you is the germ of the process of state formation and conquest. That's going to lead to the expansion of the Muslim state in the 620s, in Muhammad's lifetime, within Arabia, and then after his death, beyond Arabia, as you saw before, taking us all the way to Spain and Afghanistan. Okay, so that makes some kind of sense of both of my black swans. Let me just wind up by just noting a few implications of what I've been saying. I mean, basically, the implications are for the people who are coming in subsequent weeks to lecture here. But here are three obvious big points that are maybe worth pulling out of what I've said. First of all, thanks to the rise of Islam, Christianity no longer has a monopoly of spreading monotheism. Down to the 7th century, Christianity is the only form of monotheism on the market when it comes to spreading the religion to new peoples. From the 7th century onwards, there is competition. People can choose Christianity, but they can also choose Islam. And of course, many will choose Islam. So that's a major world historical change. Secondly, something about this ethnic factor. And I put it here that Arabs in Islam are kind of on the inside track. And I want to contrast that with both Christianity and Judaism. I mean, in the Jewish case, there's no inside track, there's just one track. And that track is for Jews. Judaism is basically monotheism for Jews. Christianity, by contrast, is monotheism for everybody. And there is no ethnic inside track. No people are more privileged than any other, except in kind of local contexts. In terms of the foundations of the religion, there is no privilege there. Whereas Islam is somewhere in the middle. There's more than one track. Everybody is welcome to join, but there's something a bit special about the Arabs. And that, I think, remains true right down to the present day. And then thirdly, something we hear a lot about, but it is very important, in the career of Muhammad, religion and politics are fused together. That's why I had those twin black swans, not one black swan here and one here. They were right next to each other. You can imagine I was very pleased when I found that picture on the web. Religion and politics are fused in the career of Muhammad, very much in contrast to Christianity, where you may remember at a certain point, Jesus says to his disciples, "My kingdom is not of this world." Muhammad's kingdom is very much of this world. There is a fusion of religion and politics here and now. Yeah, I'm worried about to say something about the Jewish contract. No, I'll leave that aside. Just take that. Let me just add one thing. This does not mean that religion and politics will be fused throughout Islamic history as they were in the time of the Prophet. What's going to happen is that religion and politics are going to come apart. But the sense that the fusion of religion and politics is paradigmatic is going to remain part of the heritage down to the present day. Okay, that's what I wanted to tell you. And now, if you have questions, we can do that. Yeah, the lights are so bright now that I'm... Yes?
From your lecture, I'm going to have to believe that Muhammad had some kind of, if you will, charisma, because he didn't have a marketing team. He had a plan, if you will, to be cohesive in the sense of the points that you raised. But was he convincing in some personal way? Do we know that in the context of, in a couple of decades, he collected people together and something cohesive going?
Right. Okay, let me say two, maybe three things. First of all, and I think he must have been. Otherwise, I find it very much, a sort of mediocre, boring person couldn't pull this off. And I'm just saying that a priori. Secondly, of course, the sources, the Muslim sources, tell you he was absolutely marvelous. But of course, religious sources do tend to play up their founder in ways that may not be strictly historical. But there are probably elements in the traditional sources that are historically, if not exactly accurate, apt. And let me just give you one of them. And the reason I think, one obvious question about any leader, your boss, is what's it like getting access to him? I mean, do you have to go through layers and layers of bureaucracy, or can you just get to him straight away? Now, the picture we get of access to Muhammad in the sources is a very simple one. And it's depicted in a kind of rather unself-conscious way. And it also fits very well with the general sort of Arabian environment, so that I tend to believe it. What it says is Muhammad came to Medina, and the first thing he did there was build a mosque. Now, that doesn't mean a mosque like this. The mosque is simply an enclosure, a bit roofed over, but most of it open to the skies. And basically, the mosque is where Muhammad and his followers, when they've got nothing else particular to do, they hang out there. And so if you want to see Muhammad, what you do is you simply go to the mosque. And what's very striking is a silence. The mosque has a gate. And gates exist to keep people out or be discriminating about who you let in. But there's absolutely nothing in the sources to indicate that anybody was standing at that gate to check who went in and out. You go right in. Then, you don't even have to check in your sword. An assassin can walk right in. So you walk in, and you look around the mosque, and you see these groups of Muslims sitting around in circles, chatting. if you don't know Muhammad by sight, you've got a problem, because he could be any of them. So you have to do something like say to someone, could you point out Muhammad to me? Or you go up to one group and you say, is one of you guys Muhammad? And he'll say, yes, me. And you then go and sit down in front of him and you say whatever you want to say, and he replies. And then you get up and go. No nonsense about kissing hands, frustration, the kind of things that you would do at the Byzantine or Persian court. Nothing like that. It's immensely simple. Now, there's probably an element of hagiography in that, I'm sure. But it also, as I say, it fits so well with the way things are done in Arabia that I tend to think it's probably true. That there's a kind of immediacy of his relationship to his followers. And that if you have somebody with a personality that appeals, is going to spread the message. And that's about as good as I can do without having been there. Yep.
Was a marriage between politics and religion instrumental in expanding the Islam?
I think absolutely yes. In that there's no way in which the Arabs could have gotten their act together to go and conquer without this peculiar religious episode of state formation that took place under Muhammad. And if the Arabs had simply come up with Islam and not gone conquering, I doubt very much that we'd even have heard of it. It would probably have just sort of died out at some point in the interior of Arabia. Nobody outside would have paid attention. So I think, yes, that this fusion of religion and politics at that point is crucial for the whole rise and expansion of Islam.
What practical or technical circumstances contributed to military success? You talk about he made a difference for people with strongholds and resources. Of course, the Christians basically rode on the success of the Roman Empire. So.
Right, so what practical circumstances contributed to the military success of the Arabs in their conquests? And I think there's 2 points that strike me as relevant here. One is that the basic geopolitics of the Middle East in the centuries before the rise of Islam, it's very simple, 2 empires, Persian Empire, Byzantine Empire. And each of those empires is a big, powerful empire with a lot of military resources. It so happens that in the course of the lifetime of Muhammad, those empires have a war. Now, they've done that many times before, but this is a war where the empires are tearing each other's guts out. And at the end of that war, in the late 620s, both of those empires are tottering from their confrontation. The Persians have lost, and they succumb to a series of coups d'etats. It's chaos. The Byzantines have won, but they've been bled white. So that, in a sense, this is the ideal moment to do something like this. And the other thing, I'm not quite sure what the consensus is on this is now, but it strikes me as very plausible. We know that starting in the 540s, there was a major outbreak of bubonic plague. Now, like what you had in the 14th century, it's happening in the 6th, 7th, and into the 8th century. And that spread, presumably it affects the Persians, though we don't have, and we're not well informed about the Persian Empire, and presumably it's there. Definitely it's in the Byzantine Empire. It's killing large numbers of people. Estimates for the 14th century, the plague could have knocked out 1/3 of the population. It could be the same kind of story back then in the 6th century into the 7th century. But thanks to God, or thanks to epidemiology, thanks in fact to the fact that rats don't like crossing deserts, the plague does not spread into Arabia. So that the empires have been demographically whacked by the plague and also fiscally undermined. If a large part of your peasant population dies, you collect a lot less taxes, to pay your troops, whereas the Arabs are just fine until the point at which they come out. Then they too start being hit by the plague, but there is a certain initial advantage there. Those are the 2 points I would make. Oh, the other thing I would add is, I mean, at the present day, there is no way in which wild tribal troops can hope to defeat a regular army, the regular army of a rich, sort of advanced country. There's no way in which the Taliban could simply have defeated the armed forces of the United States in Afghanistan. They could make life hell for them, but there's no way they could have come out into the open, fought a pitched battle, and defeated them. Now this is a modern situation. It wasn't like that in pre-modern times. A Mongol army was as good as any army in Eastern Europe or China or Korea. You don't have to be that rich to be militarily state-of-the-art in this period. And I think that's important here. So there's no big technological gap between the Byzantine and Persian troops and the Arab troops. The gap is organizational. The Arabs have a hard time getting their act together, and it's Muhammad and what he does that gets them together.
So you mentioned that Arabs have a special place in Islam. What accounts for the success of Islam with non-Arab groups, the Mongols? What would account for that?
Yeah, so what accounts for the, I mean, given that the Arabs have a special position, why would anyone else want to join? That's one way to put it. Okay, I think let's take this first in terms of the early centuries of the Islamic period. The Arabs have conquered this vast empire. Now, if you get conquered, one thing you do is pay attention to the people who conquered you. I mean, they must have done something right. What's more, if what you're interested in is not so much getting to heaven as getting ahead in this world, if the conquerors will let you, it makes a lot of sense to adopt their religion. And these conquerors do let you do that. Now, so you go and join the Arabs in one of their big garrison cities in Iraq or Egypt. You join the Arabs. They will treat you as a second-class citizen. But that can be a whole lot better than staying back in the village. There's sort of social mobility here from getting on the bandwagon. There's now a bandwagon converting to Islam. And gradually you will get a situation, I mean, the more people convert to Islam, the less sense it makes to hang back. So you'll reach the situation we have at the present day, when Christians are what, maybe 5% in the Middle East. They're very much a minority. That's one part of it. And you have other conquests by Muslims that have the same effect in other parts of the world. But the other thing, and where you're really putting me on the spot, is, say, the spread of Islam to Southeast Asia, and generally in the Indian Ocean. Because what we see there is Islam arriving not because of conquest, but because of trade. Muslims become very active in the Indian Ocean trade from very early Islamic times. Well, in fact, the Arabs were already active before, so it's just a continuity. They're now Muslim. They're sailing all the way to China, southern China. So obviously, they're stopping off in Southeast Asia. And I think what we have there, particularly I mean, you notice they don't convert China. The Chinese are perfectly satisfied with what they've got. They don't need foreign stuff. But they do gradually convert Southeast Asia. And I think what we're seeing there is the same kind of thing that Ethelbert probably saw in Christianity. Here is a package that gives you literacy. You can use it to establish a bureaucracy. You can collect more taxes. You can keep your aristocrats more in check. There's a whole lot of good things that go with adopting what in the old days we used to call a higher religion. And these days I imagine that term is politically incorrect. But a higher religion, in a sense. is the way in which these native peoples see it. There is something here that maybe it doesn't flatter our ethnic identity, but it can do things for us. And so a lot of this Southeast Asian, some of it is Arabs establishing little dynasties, but a lot of it is Southeast Asian rulers deciding that Islam can do things for me and adopting it. They don't initially take it that seriously, they mix it up with all of their own stuff, but they are adopting it. And that's what makes Indonesia at the present day the largest Muslim country in the world.
Talk a little bit about how the economic and the military aspects of state was built and Muhammad's role in that.
The economic and military aspect.
About taxes and
Yes.
the army.
Right. Okay. First of all, Muhammad is pretty light on taxation, and he has to be. I mean, taxing people is not something they enjoy. Taxing Arab tribesmen is a pretty difficult task. I mean, they can evade taxes by simply moving away. So that this is taxation light. And I think the key resource in maintaining that state in its early stages is not taxes, it's booty. In other words, you go raiding, you'll capture slaves, male and female, you'll capture livestock, maybe there'll be some other good things that you can take too. And you divide up the booty among your soldiers, and that's what keeps your soldiers happy. And I think it continues like that until they make significant conquests outside Arabia, where there is rich agriculture, where you have peasants and a real tax base. That's when they start real taxation. To say something about the military side of it, one thing that is kind of striking about Muhammad's troops is that he has no regular army. Every time he wants to mount an expedition, and he does it quite often, every time he mounts an expedition, he recruits some guys to go on that expedition. They go, they come back, and so to speak, they demobilize completely. There's no continuing standing army in between raids. So this is something that's going on very much in this kind of rather impoverished tribal context. And it's not until, again, the conquest spread well outside Arabia that we're beginning to get something like a professional army, professional armies emerging, paid for with a new tax base.
Who actually wrote the Quran and when was it codified?
Okay, let me take the second part first. The consensus, it's not universal, but the consensus in the Muslim tradition is that it was codified. In other words, a definitive text was produced in the middle of the 7th century. They don't give us an exact date for that, but sometime around 650. What happened being that you had different kind of regional variant texts of the Quran, and if you had an army made up of people from this garrison city and people from that garrison city, they would find that there were differences between the way they recited the Quran, and this nearly led to violence. And somebody came to the caliph, the Muslim ruler at the time, and said, you've got to do something about this. And he appointed a committee. Very sensible thing to do. Don't do anything yourself. Appoint a committee. Let them take the blame. So he appoints a committee, and this committee produces the definitive text. Now, as to who wrote it, there are curious contradictions in the sources. And there are two pictures that you get. One is that nothing was being written down in the time of the Prophet, or only bits and pieces were being written down. There was nothing like a kind of coherent text of the book. And then under the first Muslim ruler, there was a crisis because a lot of people who knew their Quran by heart were getting killed in battles. So they got really worried, and they got everybody together and put together a text. So that's one picture. There's no sort of single text in the time of the prophet, and it's put together from bits and pieces of what people remember soon after. And then you go on from that to the standardization of the text around 650. But the other picture is that it was all written down already in the time of the prophet. The prophet, in fact, is said to have reviewed the text, I think once a year with the angel Gabriel. He checked it out with Gabriel, and if there was anything wrong, Gabriel pointed it out and it was fixed. And the last time Muhammad does this, then, would be the final fixing of the text. Now, how you fit those divergent accounts together? Well, they don't fit together.
One last question.
Okay. Yep.
Could you just comment on, is there any role of science and education in the rise or spread of Islam?
Okay, the picture that we're given in the Muslim sources of Medina is that the literate people there were the Jews. You want your kid to learn to read and write, you send him to study with the Jews. On the other hand, rocks in Arabia are plastered with graffiti, which and they're often sort of pretty basic graffiti, saying, so to speak, Amr was here, I don't like so-and-so, whatnot. It's not sophisticated stuff, which suggests that quite a lot of ordinary tribesmen actually knew enough about reading and writing to scratch a graffiti on a rock. In terms of the conquests, I think, it's certainly education is not powering the conquests, but it becomes an important thing after the conquests. Because clearly, if you are going to establish this new religion with its scripture, you need a lot of literacy, you need scholars who can write books about it and so on. So we get the growth of an informal but quite but very extensive sort of educational system in the Islamic world. And we have little books written, say, in the 9th century about school teachers, how hard they can beat the kids, what they can't do, and so on. So yes, it's part of the story, but I don't see it as being a big causal factor.
Thank you.